Thank you. Thanks, everyone. That sounds very impressive, doesn't it? Not that impressive, really. Okay, so my name's Tony Jinks. I'm from Western Sydney University, although they want to call it Western now, apparently, so it's not WSU. They've changed the name. And like Marianne said, look, I've got a bit of a background in parapsychology and the paranormal, and I've done a more sort of mainstream book on parapsychological research and the paranormal systems of belief and experience. Is that coming through okay? No. Is it not even on? Because I can talk really loud, but if that's fine. Okay. And I also publish some journal articles here and there, and one of the main journals I publish in is the Australian Journal of Parapsychology, which is sort of a mainstream parapsychological journal, if you call it mainstream, because there's only a couple in the world. But that's sort of my background. Now, what I'm doing today, I'm a bit overwhelmed really, because I know I'm speaking to a UFO audience here, and I've got a bit of a UFO background, and it's an area I really quite like, but today it's not very UFO-y, so I hope you just bear with me and don't burn the place down, because I'll try to bring in some UFO stuff every so often if I can. But what I'm going to do today, this is a topic I really like, and I kind of got into it a few years ago, having collected a lot of information over many years before then, and I call it objects behaving badly. So it is a parapsychological area, and there are potential connections with the UFO field. If you think about the paranormal as being a unified field, well, this is an aspect of it. So have a look at it today, have a listen to it, and you might be able to incorporate some of what I tell you today into your own interests and researches. So, well, here we go. We'll start with a ufological quote from Jacques Vallée. Whenever a set of unusual circumstances is presented, it is in the nature of the human mind to analyse it until a rational pattern is encountered at some level. So that's that lovely book Dimensions, which a lot of you have read. And I thought, well, I like that quote because I've got a set of unusual circumstances and I'd like to know what the rationale is behind it. And it's all about these things called objects behaving badly. Oh, actually, I can do this, can't I? Hang on, sorry. There we go. So what are objects behaving badly and what are unusual circumstances? Well, I've got lots of stories, and here's the first one. It's from Kate, and this was from back in 2008, not her real name. So Kate was a person who lived alone, and she had quite a high-powered job in a capital city. And she came home one evening from work, and she lived in a sort of one-story kind of house, but it was like, duplexes or whatever. So she's taken a car in there. She's got her stuff out of a car. She's gone to her front door. She lives alone, of course. Has put her keys in the front door to open it up. She's heard the phone ring. So she's opened the door. She's gone into her house, answered the phone. She's come back and the keys are missing. That's not very exciting, is it? But that's Kate's story so far. So that is, to me, perhaps an object behaving badly. She has a set of car keys that have gone missing under what she considers unusual circumstances. So that's Kate's story. I never use these. I don't do much lectures anymore because at uni it's all online now, so I haven't given a lecture. Actually, I haven't even given a talk for a couple of years, so I'm a bit of a novice at this again, but I always used to go back to my computer and always press the button, so I have to remember I've got this. All right, here's my second story, Mark from 2010. Now, Mark's story was that he was with his fiancée in his lounge room watching TV one evening, and his fiancee's gone out to fix some snacks or something like that, and he's changed channels because he didn't like what he was watching, apparently. That was his story. So he quickly changed the channels on the remote using the remote control before his fiancée came back and realised. He's put the remote control down. Oh, that sounds better. He's put the remote control down next to him on the couch. His fiancee's come back. He's got told off. So he's gone to get the remote control again, and the remote control's not there. And he's got up and looked around, and he couldn't find it at all. So that's another potential story of an object behaving badly, and it's disappeared in unusual circumstances. So there's two stories, one from Kate and one from Mark. Doing it again. I'm just going to have to do this, I think, from now on. All right, so these stories are expressions, and some of you might have heard this because it's got a little bit of presence on the internet. the disappearing object phenomenon, or DOP for short. Another term from Mary Rose Barrington from the 90s was jottles, just one of those things. So I certainly haven't discovered this topic. I've just sort of got into it. Just one of those things because it's just one of those things. And the problem with this area as a parapsychological study area, and the reason why it really hasn't taken off, is because it's so mundane and it's not terribly exciting. I mean, what you were talking about earlier in the world of ufology, and I was looking up there with crop circles and other things. I mean, that's really kind of sexy stuff, isn't it? That's interesting. But this isn't really that interesting. It's a bit dull. It comes across as a little bit dull. That's why it's called just one of those things, because that's what most people think. They go, oh, it's just one of those things. My remote control's disappeared. It's just one of those things. My car keys are missing from the front door. Oh, it's just one of those things. Nevertheless, it's worth studying, and I'll explain why in a minute. But the loose definition for me is that it's some kind of inanimate object believed to have behaved anomalously or unusually. I'd say inanimate object. There's no doubt, and you know stories where people go missing and disappear. Not dealing with that so much today. I'm just looking at more your mundane household items that are going missing in that respect. So that's my little loose definition of a jottle. All right, so I had an idea. I thought, oh, I think there's a book in this. And my publisher said, have you got any books? I went, oh, I've got this idea. And they said, oh, no, we don't normally publish that kind of stuff. And then they sat around the table over in America somewhere, and they've come back to me and gone, oh, yeah, we quite like that idea, because it's happened a lot of them, you see. So I think it helped. So I had this original idea about a topic about ordinary objects that seem to behave in an unusual manner. And I sort of drew that up and thought, that looks pretty interesting. You've got keys and remotes and apples and necklaces and USBs and shoes and things like that. Things that just behave badly. Objects that are behaving badly or behaving strangely. As it turned out, I'm getting closer, aren't I? As it turned out, that's the actual book cover and title. So they gave me that, which I don't think is as good as what I thought it should be, but that's it. So it's a published book. So I actually managed to get this book published. And it was a pretty draining thing to do. So what this talk is today is essentially a bit about the contents of the book, plus a little bit of extra research I've done since the book's been published, which kind of narrows down a few issues that I was concerned about. And really today is probably the last time I'll ever talk about this, because I've given a couple of talks over the last few years on the area, but I'm a bit of a recluse. I don't tend to do many talks, only because I sort of have other things. I've got a very busy life outside of my work, so I don't tend to come out much. And I didn't mind the opportunity to do this today because I thought I finally finished the area. I can't go any further with this at all. So this will be the penultimate talk I ever give on this topic, and I think I'm going to move on to something else because I've got some things planned down the track. But hopefully today I can sort of give you an idea of what this is all about, some of the research that I've done on it, and maybe some potential interesting solutions to it at the end. Oh, I did it again. Okay. How do you begin a book on this topic? Okay, so what's the philosophy behind such a book? That's my first question. Here you go, I couldn't resist. I threw in a UFO bit to it because I knew I was talking to a bit of a UFO audience. So it's Hynek's quotes. Some Hynek's quotes from his 1972 book. I think the UFO Experience. I've got it home on the bookshelf somewhere. Anyway, so I perused through that a while ago, and I realised that he had sort of the same problem in the 70s when he was writing his UFO books. And one of the quotes, I'm not going to give you lots of quotes today, but I thought I'd start off with a few. And one of them is from Hynek, and it says about UFO books, they regale the reader with one UFO story after another, each more spectacular than the other, but little space is devoted to documentation and evaluation. What were the full circumstances surrounding the reported event? So I've highlighted those two words, documentation and evaluation, because I thought, yeah, maybe I should, to start something on the disappearing object phenomenon, I've really got to get document the phenomenon and evaluate what the evidence is, because no one's ever collected any. So that was a good way to start. So I thought, yeah, Hynek's got a good idea there. Okay, so look, I've got a lot of slide wording on the slide. You don't have to actually read the words, I'll sort of read them out. But in terms of these two quotes, I thought, look, I'll put them up there because I think it's worthwhile explaining where I come from with the book. The problem central to the treatise is whether there exist in the considerable body of data on UFOs any genuinely new empirical observations for calling for a new explanation scheme. So empirical evidence is important. The way it is from Hynek's point of view with sort of nuts and bolts extraterrestrial spacecraft, that kind of hypothesis, getting some empirical observations in there, collecting them, and from that come up maybe some kind of explanation scheme that fits the evidence. And also, he says, very little ought to be or could be said about what those new explanation schemes might be before a thorough examination of the data has been undertaken. So from that point of view, that's my philosophy behind the disappearing object phenomenon. I'll do that kind of thing to get an idea of what we're dealing with and maybe get some kind of explanation scheme going. So I'm following the Hynek approach for my book, and I thought I'll study the subject in a very sort of dry and objective manner, and I can do some primary research on this topic, a bit like the Hynek style, to examine what this phenomenon is, the disappearing object phenomenon. Okay, but I couldn't resist this. If I wrote a book on that, with that kind of philosophy, it'd be really, really boring. I mean, it might be sort of an interesting area and a bit weird, but it's really quite boring. So I couldn't resist towards the end saying, oh, look, I've got all this evidence here. It's a bit hard not to kind of go to town and come up with some really weird and wonderful ways of potentially explaining it. So that was a second half of my philosophy, was the first bit was to collect the data and sort of analyse it in a very kind of dry, objective way, scientific way. And the second was to actually play around with what I found and just see where I ended up. Okay, but, and this is obviously what everyone's thinking here, what's the point of writing a book on that? Because it's obviously not true. I mean, it's obviously rubbish. I mean, the story I gave about Kate's disappearing keys and Mark's disappearing remote control, I mean, you can't take that seriously as being something parapsychological. I mean, there's obviously explanations for it. Kate's just lost her keys, you know. Someone's taken them out of the door and run off with them. It's 1,000 different possibilities. So there must be an obvious rationalisation. So why would you even start the book? Well, I finished it, so obviously there's more to it than that, but it's a fair enough question. Because you could say that people who claim that they have objects that have disappeared in an unusual way are over-dramatising the situation, or they're suffering from absent-mindedness. They forgot where they put something and it just disappeared. Well, it didn't disappear, they just forgot where they put it. Maybe they've had some kind of memory distortion where we all lose our car in a car park sometimes. It's just the same thing with a set of keys or a remote control. There's nothing special about it. It's got straightforward psychological explanations for it. And that's fair enough. That's the kind of thing I'll explore. The reason why it's probably worth looking at a bit further is because Kate and Mark both have part 2 stories. For Kate's story, it was as follows. So she lost her keys and was annoyed, but didn't quite know why they went missing. I mean, there was no one around the house, so she assumed no one had stolen them. But after a while, it's just one of those things, and you just learn to live with it. And what you do is you go and you get more keys cut, and it's expensive, but you have to do it, and then you forget it ever happened. Now, Kate was working in a capital city and then moved to another capital city for work and bought a house this time, and she still lived on her own. And one afternoon she's come home, or one evening she's come home from work and opened the front door, closed the door, gone into a bedroom, and her car keys are sitting on the pillow. And they're the same car keys she had 6 months before that she'd lost. Exactly the same, no change at all. There's no one in the house. There's no one been in the house. She's just had a reappearing set of car keys on a pillow. As for Mark, well, his was slightly different because he had a disappearing remote control, which literally just disappeared from his lap. He's, of course, searched the whole room and couldn't find it. So he's put that down to something that was just a bit weird. But, you know, there's more important things in life than just worrying about where your remote control comes from or has disappeared to. So what you tend to do is you just go on and it's business as usual. However, he had a recurrent problem because he lost about, I think, 2 more sets of remote controls in similar circumstances over the next month or so. Same thing, he's put a remote control down and it's gone missing under his very nose, and he got to the point where he no longer bought replacement remote controls because he felt he was being targeted. And again, he didn't quite know what to make of it, but why it would target remote controls and nothing else in the house he wasn't sure of. And he's told me this story, again, a bit like, in the realm of UFOs, people have sightings, people have these kinds of experiences, and they're a bit reticent to tell people because it sounds so stupid that you've got a recurring problem with a remote control going missing. I guess the point is, we've got here a reappearing object phenomenon. It's not just called the disappearing object phenomenon. Okay, you might have disappearing objects that you never see again, but there's also situations like these two, which are my two favourite stories, that are reappearing objects. So it's called the disappearing object phenomenon. My book is called the disappearing object phenomenon because the publisher wanted that name, but it's not really a best title for it. It's really kind of a disappearing and reappearing object phenomenon as well. Okay, so it's a bit more complex than at first you might think, and that's why it's worth studying a bit more deeply. So under those circumstances, if it is worth taking more seriously, what can we find on it that's been done? Well, nothing's really been done. I guess if you go back in the literature, there was one paper published. It wasn't even a paper. It was more like a discussion piece in an obscure parapsychological journal in United Kingdom in the early 90s, where a group like this had a morning and they discussed this phenomenon and they published a little blurb about it. That's the only actual thing that's ever been published on this issue. But if you look in when I say mainstream, the standard parapsychological literature, books and journal articles going back 100 years, you do notice there is a lot of disappearing and reappearing object events occurring in a broader type of parapsychological experience. So, for example, poltergeist infestations can involve objects disappearing, not just moving around like levitating coffee cups, but things disappearing and reappearing in midair. So it's got an aspect associated with poltergeist, and then I know poltergeist and hauntings are interrelated and they're not separate things, but if you've got a haunting situation where you feel that there's a spirit presence, there's an active spirit presence there, and you can actually name what it is, maybe it's a female or a male, whatever, you've got a name to it, unlike a poltergeist, which is your noisy spirit. There's also events that look like disappearing and reappearing objects associated with hauntings as well. So you've got a context there where this kind of phenomenon has been reported before, but not as a standalone phenomenon, and that's what I'm sort of looking at in that respect. Disappearing objects as a standalone parapsychological phenomenon. All right, of course, there's more. There's not just stories about disappearing and reappearing objects. There's also stories about Martin's egg. And Martin's egg is a nice sort of, an example, one of my best examples of what's called an appearing object. So what Martin's done, he's cooking one afternoon or one evening, and he needs an egg, and he's gone to the fridge. He actually lives with people this time. As I'll tell you later on, this kind of phenomenon often happens to people who live alone, but Martin was living with a few people at the time, and he's gone to the fridge and he's opened up the egg carton, and of course nothing in there because people have used all the eggs and they haven't replaced them. And so he was a bit peeved, so he had to go and find another recipe that didn't use an egg. Now he's gone and started to find the ingredients for the new recipe. He's turned around and there's an egg sitting in the egg container. So he was again adamant that this was a legitimate event, and I'm not going to question that at the time, but that's fair enough. He's said that there's an egg that's come out of nowhere and appeared in his egg carton. So in that case, you've got an appearing object, something that he didn't own that has appeared from nowhere. So it's different to a disappearing object, and it's different to a reappearing object. It's an appearing object. So it is the more, it's like going down the rabbit hole. The more you look into the area, the more complicated it kind of gets. And wait, there's more. There's Deborah's stories. This is my fourth story. This is Deborah's story. She had gone to the library via the bus and had borrowed some library books, and she put them in a bag. And she knew exactly what library book she'd borrowed. She was very, very certain on that. She jumped back in the bus, opened her bag to have a look at the books and see which one she'd read first, and one of the books she'd borrowed was now replaced with another book. And she knew she did not borrow that book. So that is an example of a a replaced object. So a situation where an object that you are certain you have possession of over here, you turn your back, for example, and you look back and it's a different object. It's not the one you originally started with. So that's another possibility, a replaced object. So now we have appearing objects, disappearing objects, appearing objects, and replaced objects. So it is a complicated phenomenon after all. Now I am, as I suggested, not the creator of this area. There is a little bit of theorising in the past. So back in the 90s, it had a bit of a spurt, and nothing since then. And Barrington's typology, and she's the one that's really written about this a little bit, not too much, but it's a little bit out there. And she's come to 6 possibilities of how you explain this, or how do you describe the phenomenon. Not explain it, sorry. How do you describe it? You can have flyaways where things disappear forever. You can have turn-ups where things just turn up like an appearing object out of nowhere. A windfall is when something turns up that you don't own. A comeback is something that comes back to you that you own. A walkabout is when something comes back to you but not in the same place as where you've originally left it. And a trade-in is a bit like that replacement, where something that you've got has been traded in for something else. Now I took that typology and I looked at all the cases I had, and I couldn't change it at all. There's nothing I could add to that or remove from that. Although I did do this instead. I simplified it a bit. So I thought, if I'm going to do the Hynek approach and try to study this very, very rationally and empirically, then I'll use 4 terms. And I've used these already, so you're familiar with them. Disappearing objects, appearing objects, reappearing objects, and replaced objects. And they incorporate all those Barrington expressions. So for example, a reappearing object is a comeback and a walkabout. So you put your object down here like this, and you turn your back and you look, it's gone. And then a little time later, it either reappears exactly where you left it, which would be a comeback, or you find it in another room where it's a walkabout. But those 4 major headings are the things I'm really looking at. So now's the time to begin the journey. So what do we do there? Well, I have to, following a Hynek approach, define what we're looking for, collect the data and assess it. And before I can even do that, I have to think about what we look for, because there's not much point collecting lots of data if you don't really have some kind of structure to collect it with. So first thing is, what's the object's name? And there's ways to simplify it too. So for example, a USB might go missing under extraordinary circumstances. Well, maybe we should call that a computer accessory, because it might incorporate things like mice and mice pads and things like that. So maybe it's easier to deal with not individual names, but some kind of category. So that's the first thing we do, is we categorise our data that we collect. Significance of objects is also very important as well, because you think about it, how important are those objects? If it was a lot of things going missing, for example, if it's a disappearing object, and they were really, really, really expensive, like diamond rings, well, you might suspect that people are stealing them. So that's fair enough. We don't know, because no one had ever done the research. So that's something that's important, object significance. Also the location. Did it happen, and I've got some options down there, was it a precise or imprecise location? In other words, do you remember putting your object down like that? You knew where you put it, and it's gone missing. Or did you sort of have this thing where, I left my wallet somewhere around the house, I don't quite know, it's a bit imprecise. See, under those circumstances, the story is not quite as strong, it's not quite as interesting or impressive as if it was a precise location where you left it. Also, it could be familiar or unfamiliar situations or locations where you've done it. So in other words, you know it's a familiar house, you've lost your wallet in your house, or did you lose your wallet on a park bench? In which case it's probably not as impressive as losing it in the house, if you get what I mean. So knowing all this information is very important when you collect the data, because if we find that very expensive items go missing in unfamiliar locations primarily, then you wouldn't think there's much to the phenomenon. It's probably things being stolen or taken when you're not looking. All right, don't worry about this slide. Don't even look at it. It's so complicated that even I have trouble with it sometimes. What I'm just trying to get out of this is that we also have to think about the time delays. So when we ask people about their experiences with this phenomenon, what kind of time delays or time periods are we looking at here? So for example, you put your device down here and then you turn your back and you look back again, it's gone. And it took like 1 second. That's pretty impressive. If I put this down and I went away for 24 hours and came back and it was gone, and I said, oh, that was an unusual disappearance, there must be something parapsychological or paranormal about it, well, you might say, well, it was 24 hours and there's been people in the room. Are you sure? So you can see that the importance of a time delay, or we need to collect that kind of information. And it gets really, really complicated. So when you have, like down the bottom here, a reappearing object, you've got things like last seen delays and the lost delay, how long it was lost for, when it reappeared, how long was it since you've been in that location where it reappeared, and so forth. So again, I'm not worried too much about showing that as you looking at it and understanding it. It's more like, how impressive does that look? So it's really complicated. But that information was collected, hopefully to get some kind of idea of what's going on with this phenomenon. And we have to collect more things. So for example, object size. How big are the things that go missing? I mean, if they're tiny things like pins and needles, well, it's not hard to lose them, as opposed to being an elephant. So object size is important. It's interesting to look at the sex and occupation of the people who are suffering from this. So maybe there's a phenomenon there. Probably the word suffering is not the best one. Maybe victims, experience, whatever, they're experiencing something. So their age, the history of the case is important. I mean, are we dealing with things that happened yesterday or things that people tell me about that happened 30 years ago? Maybe there's some kind of memory distortion involved there. Are they witnessed? Are there multiple people having this experience at the same time, or is it just happening to one person? Repeaters and recurrence. Well, there's a UFO aspect, isn't it? Repeaters. Does it happen to people over and over again? That example of Mark and the remote control, he seemed to be a repeater, whereas Kate wasn't. So we need to collect that information because it might be relevant. And another thing is the meaningfulness of it, and even the sense of presence. When this thing happened, did people feel that there was someone in the room looking at them invisibly, laughing at them when it happens? How meaningful was it? When things appear often, it's like I've just been to Great Auntie Gertrude's funeral, and I've come in and there's Great Auntie Gertrude's brooch lying on the floor that shouldn't be in my house. Is that because she's saying goodbye and here's a gift for me? That kind of thing. So it's important to get the meaningfulness of the event. Or is it completely meaningless? The way that Kate's keys went missing and came back, that seemed meaningless, but there was a purpose to it. So I'm interested in finding that information as well. Well, here we go, the results. So I collected lots and lots and lots and lots of stories over a long period of time. And again, I've got lots of tables here, and I'm really just trying to show you that you can conduct research in a parapsychological area and do it properly. And get some interesting results out of it. So I'm sort of fusing standard research techniques with a parapsychological flavour. And I got 385 stories, which took a long time, and they were good ones. So I got rid of all the ones that I felt had even a skerrick of iffiness about them, and I just got the standard good strong narratives. And the interesting thing is that 50%, and that's why the 5 zeros in red there bolded, 50% are reappearances, which is interesting because if it was just a disappearing object phenomenon and things just got lost, then you might think that the disappearances would be predominant, but they're not. Reappearing objects are half the cases from those 385, which was an interesting finding. And when it comes to significance, I went from sort of high, medium, low to no significance, and then there's sort of objects that are unowned, which they have to have their own category. The point being is something like of high significance would be a wedding ring or a family heirloom. Something of no significance would be like a rubber glove or a match. Medium significances took in 49%. So they're the objects that went missing, and they're things that, look, you don't want to lose, or you don't want to have strange things happen to, but if they did go missing, then it's not the end of the world. I guess your car keys and your and your wallets. I mean, they're not of high value where you're distraught if you lose them, but you are annoyed about them. And that tends to be what the predominant type of object that goes missing is that kind of style of thing. If it was lots of high significance objects, that's where you start suspecting that maybe things have been stolen, perhaps, if you have that kind of bent. But there's only 8% of high. So it's just a mundane, annoying phenomenon that targets certain people in certain ways. So that was some findings that were quite interesting. And now here's an interesting finding here too. The similarity between what disappears and what appears. And these are different cases. So in the first box, it shows you the types of objects that behave badly for disappearances, and it's things like food, jewellery, clothing and household good in that order, with utensils coming fifth. For appearing objects, it's also food, jewellery, clothing and household goods, with money coming fifth. So there's an interesting similarity between those kinds of objects. Now, I've just got a little unowned in the very bottom right corner there. Money is really interesting for appearing objects. It's something that stands out a bit to the side of this phenomenon when you investigate it, but when these objects appear, often it's something you own anyway and it's just appeared in a really weird place. Like an apple has appeared on a table where 5 minutes ago there was nothing there and you're the only one in the house. I mean, that could be an example of an appearing food object, and you own the apple because it was sitting over in the apple tray. Money is different. Money is coins, individual coins that appear from nowhere, and it's the only example where people actually see it happen. All of this stuff is happening when you're not looking at it, you're not visualising it, but for some reason there's enough stories about money just sort of appearing in midair and dropping to the floor, a coin, and rattling on the floor, to make it interesting enough. So 9% of those cases were money. You don't have to actually necessarily see it, it's more likely that you hear it. So you're in a room on your own and you'll turn your back and you'll hear this clunk on the floor or a rattle on the floor. You look around and there's a coin going like this, and it's landed. And there's nothing special about the coin. It's not that the coin's some gold doubloon from 1600 Spanish Inquisition, Spanish around the world stuff. Nothing exciting like that. It's just money that's just money that you use normally in your wallet, and it's not old, it's not new, it's just money. So coins, 50-cent coin, 20-cent coin, something like that. So that's an interesting aspect of it, but the bigger picture here is that the types of things that go disappearing are the kinds of things that go appearing, which I've got a little bit more to say about next. Different from reappearances. Things that reappear are different objects again. So keys, jewellery, computer parts, TV remotes and food are the most common reappearing objects. And that kind of lets me give the first claim that maybe someone's disappearance is someone else's appearance, if it's an unowned object. So if I go back to that last one, if jewellery, for example, goes missing from your dresser and you never see it again, over here, jewellery appears on someone's dresser that they don't own. Now, it's more likely they will own it, but there's enough cases in the collection where unowned objects have appeared. So you can always throw out that possibility that someone's lost something in the ether and it's reappeared or it's appeared to someone else as a windfall. And that's something that the data potentially shows. So it's interesting to look at it from that perspective. But point being here, reappearances are a very different set of objects that go missing and reappear. So what are my conclusions? Well, I mean, I could just keep going for hours and hours and put everyone to complete sleep. But I'll rush ahead and say, okay, I did look at this data very, very strongly and deeply, and it took me a long time to come to some kind of conclusion because the data is really messy. There's nothing clean and nice about it. But I found two variables that appear to be reasonably relevant to it. The first is interaction, okay? And the second is intention. So for disappearances, I found that interactions seem to be reasonably important. When I say interaction, you actually touch the object relatively recently before it went missing. So you'd touch that, say in this case, you'd had an apple in your hand and you just touched it, you put it down and it went missing. Okay? Thing about disappearances also, they tend to be what I call non-intentional. So there was nothing special about the object, there was nothing special about the circumstances, there was no sense of presence or meaningfulness or anything like that. It just seemed pointless. Something went missing, you just touched it and you never saw it again, and it didn't seem very, very important or purposeful, so to speak. So they're the two variables, interaction and intention. And for disappearances, interaction is important and it's non-intentional. For appearances, there was no interaction at all because they've appeared from nowhere and you haven't touched them because they've appeared. On the other hand, it doesn't matter whether it's an owned or unowned object. In other words, something you own and it should be in the cupboard and it's now appeared at your feet where it shouldn't be. That's an owned object. An unowned one would be a coin that you never knew about, or some weird piece of jewellery that's just appeared somewhere that it shouldn't. There seems to be a bit of intention to that. So when that happens to someone, they go, there was a purpose to it. It's a message or something similar to that. So for appearances, we don't have interaction and we have intention. And that's an interesting finding. I'm throwing it out there because it's not a clean finding, but it's something that I sort of dug up from the data and it seems quite relevant. When it comes to reappearances, I've come to two conclusions. You either have a fast loss, fast return, or a relocation which is a bit slower. So what tends to happen is this. A return is when you put your object down and you turn your back and it comes back to the same spot that you saw it last. But it wasn't there for a while, so you really thought it was gone. They're interactive and non-intentional. So you put something down, you've turned your back, you looked, it's gone, and then you turn your back again, it reappears, and it doesn't seem to do that for any particular purpose. A relocation, on the other hand, when you put the object down and it goes, but when it comes back it's gone to somewhere else, that seems to have less interaction because it's less likely the person has just put it down. They might have put it down half an hour ago or an hour ago, but when it reappears in such a way it's almost presented to the person, like, oh, look at me, I've come back. Are you scared now? Or something like that. So there seems to be some kind of intention with it. Although when it comes to non-interaction, it's not really possible to know whether, if you put something down, it hasn't disappeared straight away, even though you've been walking around the house for 6 hours before you realise it's missing. We don't actually know when it happened. Although there does seem to be a bit of a difference between returns and relocations, particularly that one happens very fast, a return, and a relocation takes a bit longer to occur, and it seems to have some kind of intention to it. Finally, replacements. That story about Deborah's book, very rare. I mean, it's really hard to find a good replacement story. And for that reason, I kind of dismiss them as being just something I can't get a good handle on. It's nice, they're interesting to hear about, they're fun stories, but I don't go into them in too much more detail because I just have so few of them. But they seem to be interactive and intentional. So you have touched the object and there seems to be an intention for the change. At least that's what the sufferer, the experient, suggests there was some purpose to it. All right, so what I need to do is just to convince you that as a psychologist at a university setting, that I've covered all the grounds of what the potential psychological reasons for this occurring could be. So I actually went through this step by step. Do I trust my collection? Yes, I do. Now, okay, all 385 might be lying to me and having a great giggle together, if they potentially know each other, which they don't, but they could be having a good giggle and saying, oh, I'll pull the Swifty over Tony, he's really believing in this stuff. No, it's like anything when it comes to stories. I mean, from the ufology area or haunting stories or whatever, there's a point where you're convinced enough with a legitimacy of what your data is that say, yeah, look, you know what, I think these people, at least they believe what they are telling me, they're not making it up. Were the objects lost or stolen? Well, from the data, it suggests they're not. From all the stories I've looked at, there's no indication that there's a consistent situation where people are losing or having their things stolen because some other person's involved. It's not like that. I've looked at historical memories. The idea of, how if it happened a long time ago, there's all sorts of fancy psychological, mumbo jumbo jingo kind of language to use, like transience and telescoping, to try to describe how people's memories change over a very long period of time. But the stories aren't old. They're usually within the last couple of months. When I get them, they're quite recent. Not all of them, but most of them. So I'm not really convinced that historical memories are involved here. We have recent memories, so they should be pretty good, pretty strong. I've also looked at other possibilities, errors commission, things like suggestibility, illusory correlations, confirmation bias, all these kinds of psychological catchphrases. Wasn't convinced that they could help explain in any way or rationalise these experiences. Similarly, perceptual blindness. So I'll spend a little bit of time on this one because it's a good one. If I told someone that is what happened, my experience was a disappearing object, for example, they'd say, oh, you're just suffering from perceptual blindness. What do you mean by that? Oh, you know when you go in the car park and you park your car and you come back, you can't find it, but you're staring right at your car. And then you go, oh, there it is. For some reason, you just couldn't see it. And that's what's happening with the disappearing object phenomenon. Well, okay, well, what is perceptual blindness? In the literature, it's called inattentional blindness. And all it is a couple of studies where people sit down in an experimental setting and they're told to do something really complicated, like a mathematics task. And what you do, you get someone dressed in a gorilla suit to walk past their peripheral vision here, and 25% of the time, they won't see the person dressed as a gorilla because they're so engrossed in what they're doing. You know, well, 75% of the time they do. That's the first thing. The second thing is, how does that apply to disappearing objects? Because the whole point is you're so engrossed in a task that you don't see what's around you. When people lose things, and you know what it's like when you lose something, you actually spend all your attentional resources trying to find it. And you push out everything else and go, I've got to find this thing. Where is it? Where is it? So it's a different kind of situation to what we're dealing with. So you can't use that inattentional blindness off-the-shelf explanation and throw it down and go, that's what it is, because it's not what we're dealing with. And that's one of the problems with these psychological rationalizations. They're used inappropriately. They sound impressive, but you've really got to know what they are to realise that they're not actually as good as you think they are. I looked at altered states of consciousness too, things like the concept of hallucination, which is really only a description. It doesn't explain anything. So that doesn't really work. I even looked into auto-hypnosis. So I looked into a lot of possibilities and wasn't really satisfied. I'll show you something, and this is new research. I've never sort of presented this before, and it's sort of, like I said, it sort of caps off my topic because I think I finally finished it. This is as far as I can go with it. But there's other things you can blame the disappearing object phenomenon on, and it could be things like absent-mindedness or pre-existing beliefs. You know, if you believe something, if you believe in this phenomenon, you're going to have it happen to you more often because of that kind of belief systems. So I thought, okay, maybe I can actually do some proper, inverted commas, study on this, actually do some psychological research, the way that the psychologists do it in universities, to see if this is a legitimate claim. And just a quick note on paranormal research. The research, you're aware of research the way I've just talked about my research. You collect data. The same way in ufology or in hauntings or whatever, you collect stories about people's experiences and you look at those stories and you get the details and you maybe make some kind of connections and correlations amongst them. And that's a type of research, that's paranormal research. In a university setting, there's no such thing as paranormal research. Okay? There's parapsychological research, which goes back to the days of Duke University and Ryde and others, looking for things like, extrasensory perception and evidence of such. That's not really conducted very much anymore, only because there's a bit of it's career suicide. So if I know a number of occasions where, people do conduct this kind of research, looking at the nuances of parapsychology and if they can add any more variables to why people have, telepathic experiences or something like that. If you do that in a university setting, it can be dangerous because if some member of the public complains or a head of department decides that they don't like you doing that anymore, you can make your life quite difficult. My kind of research is the cowardly research, which is pretty much looking at people who report beliefs and experiences, or report experiences in the paranormal and have beliefs in the paranormal, and looking at the psychological traits associated with those people. And that's what paranormal research is in psychology. It's that kind of research. It's very safe research. But it's usually conducted by individuals who have no background in the paranormal. So they'll just come along and go, paranormal stuff's rubbish. So I'm going to look at people who believe in the paranormal and I'm going to show all these problems they have. I'm going to give them a questionnaire. They're going to tell me how much they believe in it. And then I'll go test them on these other things. And I'll correlate really strongly that these people have got some kind of psychological problem. You look at the research that these people do, and the correlations aren't very strong anyway, but it's like it's like a statistic that's a significance that's not really something to jump up and down about, but they'll say, oh, we've proved this. I mean, the people that do this research primarily haven't got a background in it. And I do that kind of research, but I do it in a way that kind of hopefully makes it sort of more, puts them on the back foot. So I'll sort of fight back with that same kind of research. Anyway, so what I did very quickly, this is back in 2015, I created an experience survey just to get some ideas about the stories that people have about disappearing objects. And if you fill out the survey and you've actually had a legitimate experience, then they're called experienced, these people. On the other hand, if you've got people who haven't had these experiences, these disappearing object style experiences, you can't just say, thanks very much, go, because of course everyone's going to want to go. So they have to make up a story. And here we go, ufology. Alvin Lawson, the birth memories hypothesis of abductions. Well, he did this kind of study with William McCall back in the 70s. And I like it. I actually like imaginary stories because you can compare real stories with imaginary stories and you can look at the differences between them. So I took a bit of that sort of Alvin Lawson style of research and I brought it into this kind of research. So I can identify people who've really had experiences and people who are pretending they've had one and look at their stories. And again, I'm going to put up a bit of statistics here. You don't have to look at it. I just want to make the point that there's actually a lot of people. I thought it was like 1 in 10 for some reason initially with my early research, but from the studies I'm doing, it's 50-50. So of the 80 people I've got, about 40 claim to have real legitimate disappearing object style experiences, and about 40 people, 50%, were making it up. So that was interesting. I thought, it's more than I thought. Very different stories. So if you've had a real experience, then it's going to be different to if you're making it up, which is interesting as well, because I'm thinking, well, okay, if you're making up a story about a disappearing object, it's going to be a disappearing object primarily, because it's easy to imagine something disappearing and never coming back. If you've had a real experience, chances are it's more sophisticated. It's like a reappearing object. So there are differences between real stories and made-up stories, which was heartening. Don't worry about all this. All the important thing I'm going to say is I did the research. That's what it's showing you. I did the statistics on this. And the first is paranormal attribution. Are you a believer in the paranormal and that's why you've had the experiences? No. Trust me on that one. Stats up there? No, you're not. What about absent-mindedness? Are you just an absent-minded person? So you give them these kinds of tests to see if they're absent-minded. No, they're not. If they've really had an experience, they're no different to anyone else in terms of their absent-mindedness, which is a positive. What about magical ideation? This propensity to believe unconnected events are causally related. Well, there was a statistical difference. It didn't look like much, an average of 10 versus an average of 8, but it seemed that experience were more likely to be magical ideators or thinking magically than imaginary. So I thought, okay, I'll do some more research on this in 2016, get some more people and look at this further. Maybe that's why people are claiming these kinds of experiences. Maybe they've got some magical ideation in there somewhere that makes them make up these stories or see things out there that aren't really there. So I repeated the study again and found a 50-50 split once more, which suggests that it's quite reliable, that maybe there are more people suffering, experiencing these things than I originally thought. And so I repeated the original scale again to see if these people were magical ideators, and yes, they were. Same finding again. So it's a consistent, strong finding. However, I went a bit further and looked at some more sophisticated ways of measuring this thing called magical ideation. One of them is called tolerance of ambiguity. People that just can't tolerate ambiguity. In other words, some people will put something down on the ground and it goes missing, and they go, oh, you know what, there's an ambiguous situation. I don't quite know why it happened, and I can tolerate that. I can deal with it. I'll get on and do something else. Other people might go, oh, no, I can't tolerate that ambiguity. I have to have an explanation for it. It must be paranormal. Well, didn't find a difference between these people. So the experience groups and the imaginary groups, they're not different to each other. They both have the same level of tolerance of ambiguity. So I can't blame it on that. And I'm just showing up there the kinds of tests I use, the standard psychological tests that people in psychology, not necessarily parapsychology or paranormal, just normal, inverted commas, normal psychology use. Also, loose associationism, this idea that, well, this is the one that's dangerous, because loose associationism is related to schizotypy. And schizotypy is on that graduation towards schizophrenia. So you can see how normal psychology often does this. If you show some kind of deviant belief in mainstream science, then what you can do, you can give enough questionnaires eventually to get a finding which suggests that people have some kind of potential psychological disturbance. And loose associationism is one of those things. So that's the idea that, you know, if I said to you, green, you think, okay, green. Well, apples are green. Oh, apples are also red. And a fire truck's red. So you've gone from green to red using a couple of jumps, okay? Someone with loose associationism, which is a type of, an expression of magical ideation, goes, you say green, they go fire truck. So they've gone through those nodes very, very quickly. And you can't understand why they've got from green to fire truck, because fire trucks aren't green. Well, they have. They've done it logically, but in a way that it's not, it's very creative. And of course, the point being, if that goes too far, then you have a disorder of thought, which is expressed in schizophrenia. But the creative, that's why they say, well, creative people have schizotypy. They've got this trait of schizotypy, which can result in schizophrenic types of symptoms. Anyway, point being, no, they don't. My experience are no different to my imaginaries in terms of this idea of loose associationism. So they're not jumping to conclusions. They're not saying, oh, okay, my wallet went missing, so therefore it must be a fairy. They're inverted commas, as rational as people are imagining it. So there's nothing there. There's no evidence in any of the research I've done to suggest that people who are reporting these disappearing object phenomena type experiences have anything you can pin on them psychologically that's different from people who haven't had them. And that's the important point I'm making. So the stats here, I'm just showing all the different tasks that I've used to show that there's nothing to find with these people. No. They're the same as anyone else. Okay, so my idea, and this is a bit of a sideline, it's a bit you know, off the track here, but my thinking of why that magical ideation scale finding I found in the first place is the problem with psychological scales. That's why you've got to really be careful of trusting anything that's published like this, because if you look into it deeply, you can see some reasons why people score that way. So I found, between my experiences and my imaginaries, about, what's that? Say it's about an 8, and that's about 11, 8, 9, 10, 11, 3 points of difference. And it's a binary scale. It's not a very good one. It's like a yes or no scale. So three higher for the people who've experienced the DOP versus imaginaries. 3 higher is 3 questions. 3 questions. So they're answering 3 questions affirmatively that the other group isn't. And the problem is those 3 questions, if you look at them in the questionnaire, you think they're just describing a disappearing object phenomenon experience. So one of them, for example, is this. Item 6. Things sometimes seem to be in different places when I get home, even though no one's been there. Well, if I've had an experience, a legitimate DOP type experience, or JOTL, I'd say, yeah, it's true. Because I've gone home and something's moved. Whereas someone who hasn't had it would go, no, it hasn't happened to me. Now that's taken by psychology as being, there's something wrong with you. But really it's not. If there's nothing else wrong with these people at all, wrong with them, you can't identify any differences. And we can accept that maybe they've had a legitimate experience. They're just describing what happened to them. They're not. That's no evidence to suggest they have some kind of magical ideation. You can see the twist that mainstream psychology does. It turns a legitimate experience into something that's dysfunctional, and it's really dangerous, and I don't like it. And that's why in the studies I do like this, I sort of use these kind of questionnaires against mainstream psychology to show that the findings, I can use the same weapons that you use to sort of discount people's paranormal experiences and beliefs. I can turn that around and throw it back and say, well, they seem perfectly normal to me, but you know, I'm about the only one doing that. It's not a big area in psychology, trust me. There's very few people study the stuff anyway, because who studies paranormal? I mean, it's all a bunch of rubbish, isn't it? Mainstream approach, but it's important to keep plugging away at this and using these kinds of tools. So anyway, that was my finding. So the point being is that I think these people are probably reporting legitimate experiences. So finishing off, because I know it's getting late in the afternoon, I apologise. I threw out some ideas of what might be happening. In my opinion, this is my idea. Now, I haven't done this. I finished this probably end of last year, or beginning of last year, sorry. So it's been a while, and I haven't talked about it for a while. So I had a look at these yesterday, and I thought, oh, I don't know anything about what I've set up here. And then I got my book out and I read it, and I thought, oh, this is actually a pretty good book. Like, wow, that's really interesting. Oh, I didn't think of that. I must have. So anyway, I'm not really on top of it as much as I should be, but this is the kind of thing I came up with. When you've just done it, you can imagine you're so fresh that you're just so on top of the stuff, but I'm not quite as on top of the material as I should be. Any one of you out there would know more about what I'm saying now than I do. So I'm more than happy to. I've talked over the years to a lot of audiences like yourself, and you're really. I'm buttering up here, but you're really quite educated, and I often can't answer the questions you throw at me because you've got more of a background and experience than I do on it. So just be kind to me and see what I can do with it. The first is I thought, okay, there's three possibilities. The mechanistic universe, and again, I'm going to plug the book a bit here, but I go into Charles Fort quite a bit because Charles Fort was, of course, the past master of concepts like teleportation and so forth. So I thought the jottles, or these experiences, are caused by some kind of fundamental mechanistic process which are beyond current scientific validation at now, although they're widely speculated on. So things like invisibility. Maybe these things have actually literally physically become invisible. Or maybe there's some kind of teleportation occurring. The objects have been teleported from one spot to another. And these are the words we bandy around all the time. So when someone says they've lost their keys, they say, oh, they must have been teleported somewhere, or it went down a wormhole. So we all use these kinds of words to describe or explain what's happened to our objects. But they're worth looking at because why not? I mean, they're legitimate concepts. Parallel universes also. My object popped into a parallel universe for a bit and it came back again. Or it was a dimensional shift. It went to another dimension and came back. So, these are things I explore in quite depth. And actually, like I said, read it and I went, oh, that's really clever. I didn't know I knew that, but don't ask me now because I've probably forgotten. Anyway, I thought when I did my deep analysis of this, and I'm no physicist, but I had a good look at it. I thought, it's good for interaction because we can talk about, maybe interacting with this and physically, I don't know, changing its quantum state and quantum teleporting the information from here over to there. That's not what quantum teleportation is, but you can make up these kinds of things. The information contained in that quantum state of this object has been somehow moved somewhere else. And I depended on Charles Fort a lot for this because Charles Fort's the one that made up the word teleportation, and he actually used it when he created it for his books back in the early 1900s. He used it for this very phenomenon. So it was interesting that he developed it for this. He didn't call it the disappearing object phenomenon, but it was, that was his idea that we have restocking of the universe, where if something's short in one part of the universe, it's restocked somewhere else and it travels through teleportation. So it's good to read his early work. But having a look at it, I couldn't find anything that really covered most of what jottles are, using this kind of idea that there's a mechanistic universe. It's a mindless universe that just has these physical processes that we sometimes tap into, and it allows things to be moved around the place in the way we see with a normal jottle type experience. So I wasn't happy with the idea of teleportation because really quantum teleportation is different to teleportation, and I won't go into that now. Multiverses, the idea of alternative, not parallel universes, they have to be alternative universes because they can be contacted, obviously. I go into the Hugh Everett style of and the DeWitt style of like the many worlds interpretation of at any one time with any one quantum event we have a splitting of universes, and then we have this big bubble being created, infinite bubble, and there's a few stories you look at with people who have allegedly travelled. You would have heard of the Tokyo Torred, and then there's Lena Garcia. I think there was a recent one on the internet where this Spanish lady had woke up one day and things were different in the environment around her. Well, that's the kind of context that I'm using to think, well, maybe there are situations where people could go from one bubble universe to the other, and objects were there in one universe aren't there in another. It's a hard argument to make. It's better to talk about the many minds interpretation. That's the MMI here, not many worlds. So objects aren't travelling amongst these bubble universes, but your consciousness is. So there might be a higher order consciousness, that your many consciousnesses which are split up as universes are being created are subsumed into a higher consciousness, and you travel through if you get what I'm saying. But it's a hard argument to make with jottles. I mean, it's an interesting concept, and there's no reason why you can't look at it. It's an interpretation. It's not even a theory or a model because it's so untestable. As an interpretation of having multiple universes and you being able to travel in some way amongst them, doesn't really fit what we talk about as being bread and butter jottles that I'm talking about. So I wasn't too happy about those. Other dimensions, well, when we talk about other dimensions, we're really talking about other universes in that sort of that many worlds interpretation. Dimensions mean, another like a fourth dimension to the array, a fifth dimension to the array, and it doesn't really fit jottles either. So all I'm saying in this kind of slide is I looked at the mechanistic universe, wasn't very happy with the possibilities. I'm not saying they're not relevant, but didn't really fit the stories that I was looking at. So I came to a second possibility. We're looking at external paraphysical agents, things like poltergeists and guardian angels and revenants and fairies, elementals, and so forth. And I love this stuff, and I spent a lot of time on this. And there's no doubt that it gives some intention to these stories. So when you say that something's been jottled, an object of yours, it's returned or it's appeared, then you can blame it on the fairy. You can blame it on Great Auntie Gertrude or something like that, some paraphysical entity. There are problems with that. I mean, I quite like the idea of something in a higher vibrational state coming along and vibrating the physical properties of an object to their state, which makes it disappear, inverted commas, and then it reappears later on. I mean, it's got the intention to it of why it might happen. They're being mischievous. But really, from mainstream physics, you can't talk about high vibrational states making things necessarily disappear. I think you have to use that word more carefully. It's a different word, vibration. And I don't mind the sort of theosophical arguments about elementals in a different vibrational state to people being able to come in and out and affect things. But it didn't really apply to jottles again. So I had to make this convoluted argument about why I didn't think it worked very well. And the thing about them, I suppose the most important thing is when you think about being troubled by fairies or having a haunting in your house and so forth. There's a lot more than just disappearing objects that are occurring. There's apparitions, there's potential smells and all these other things that can happen. Jottles or disappearing objects are discontinuities, that's the word given. In other words, they happen on their own. Nothing else has happened. You have a very, very dry, dull life, and there's one thing that happens, it's a jottle. So being a discontinuity means it doesn't have a context, a wider paranormal context to it. And for that reason, I wasn't terribly happy with this idea. I'm not saying that paraphysical entities don't cause disappearances and reappearances of objects, but it didn't fit the standard jottle kind of paradigm. So I moved on from there and I thought, okay, well, here's another one, human-centered causes. And that's probably the most logical possibility, the one that fits best, I think, from an argument's point of view. So it's some kind of psychokinetic ability. It's tied up with psychokinesis. So somehow you've been able to harness the forces that are able to make things disappear and reappear. And it kind of gives you that intention, and it also potentially gives the interaction aspect to it. So it's for some obscure reason, you yourself, the experient, have caused that jottle to occur, and you might blame it on a fairy or a goblin or Great Auntie Gertrude, but it's actually some kind of deeper psychological process that you've enacted. So I like it as an option. It works really well. So it's recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis. That's the RSPK thing, William Rolls and his ideas. I am nearly finished. I'm literally 2 slides away. So you've got households being affected by jottles, domestic objects, which is what happens with RSPK. People who are affected by objects moving around the house. and it's not an external entity. It's you know, someone in that house is causing that psychokinesis to occur and causing objects to be moved around. So look, there's a lot of similarities. Household objects, domestic objects, in the range of the body's kinetic energy. So small objects are moved, not big objects. That's why you don't get chairs and tables disappearing. It's more smaller things. Could maybe help to explain that. There's an inverse distant law which helps with interaction. So in other words, William Roll and others have talked about psychokinesis occurring in close proximity, and as the farther you get away, you know, exponentially, the less force you can have over control you can have over this. There's also object and area focusing. So particular types of objects are targeted in psychokinesis in these RSPK events, similarly to jottles. Area focus. Jottles are very, very prevalent in kitchens and bedrooms. Similarly, when you have an RSPK event in a house, particular areas of the house are targeted a lot. So there's a lot of commonality between the two types of events. There's even some interesting theories that might account for it. So, for example, 0-point energy and concepts of entanglement and all these kind of other sort of, you know, bordering on the physics about how RSPK might work. Yeah, maybe there's some intention there too, because if you're entangled with an object and you can harness that 0-point energy around that object through psi waves or whatever you want to say, and you're really cranky with the object, or you've got some kind of relationship with it, that's what the entanglement means, then it disappears. Because I know there's one story where a person was scrubbing something and they were really annoyed and angry with scrubbing something, and they walked away and the scrubbing brush disappeared. And you can say, well, okay, that's why, because deep down their deep subconscious was so angry with that thing and they were entangled with this object that they actually caused it to disappear out of spite, or just because they didn't want to do any more work anymore. So, you know, there's some possibilities there that the other two theories don't kind of have. Trouble is, it's an adult phenomenon. You know, we all know RSPK tends to be an adolescent issue. That's the way it's written about. I'm not saying it is, but it's a very strongly adolescent-focused event. Jottles tend to happen in adulthood. We don't see many levitations with jottles. It's just disappearing and appearing objects, whereas RSPK tends to primarily be levitations of objects. So there's a bit of a difference there. So I'm not saying it's a unified, the be-all and end-all theory, but it's worth looking at. This is this is like my second last slide. The thing is, again, this is theoretical. You are assuming that some undesired, unintended, and unanticipated occurrence has been because your unconscious forces have caused something to disappear. Now, it's unpracticed. So what you're almost saying is that there's a part of me subconsciously that can actually make things disappear and reappear. I don't believe that can happen, but this part of me can and does believe it and can do it, and it's not practiced. What is it? It's part of my consciousness. Where is consciousness? Is it located in the brain, or is it somewhere sort of broader than that? In which case, why just not call it a discarnate entity? So we're assuming that we have some part of our brain that's able to do things that we can't believe we can do. It's almost like just as no different from saying it's great Auntie Gertrude over there hovering in the corner as a ghost. There's an argument to, again, the rabbit hole. The deeper you get, the more you realise what you're dealing with is very intangible. It's hard to explain anything at all. So finally, it's quite conceivable that nature should present us with circumstances so deeply organised, our observational and logical errors would entirely mask the pattern identified. So this is ending it off, saying, Vali has said, maybe it's just so complicated we'll never know what's causing these jottles. I, on the other hand, have got one idea. If there's one thing, this is my interpretation of it, if there's one thing that jottles have, is seamlessness. When you lose something and it returns, it's as though it's always been that situation. They're not hot to touch when they return. They're not different anyway. They're exactly the same. So what I suggest is that maybe we have, and I'll say conscious observation by multiple conscious states is responsible for collapsing reality. That's why we have this sort of this consensual reality we have now. And anything that's a jottle is just a perfectly sensible byproduct of this. So what I'm saying is this. This sort of matches, if there's a unified theory, this is probably the one that I would choose. Imagine you have objects around you in the real world and they're all sort of in this sort of It's this quantum soup around us, and we, through observation, collapse it into reality, into physical reality. But as you know, it's not necessarily physical as we know it, because it can be uncollapsed back into a quantum soup without observation. And each of these circles is consciousness. It's a person, so to speak. And when you have objects that are looked at by many people and acknowledged by many people, then you have a very, very strong object. And you can't just turn your back and it just doesn't disappear. But there's situations where there's one person who has a wallet that not many other people are aware of. They're not entangled with that wallet the way that this person is. And often these people live alone. And these things are in parlor states of reality. And there are situations where maybe, and it's more complicated than this, and I'm not really giving it justice, but maybe that reality is not as strong a reality as this poster here, which has probably been kept in reality by lots of you observing at one time. Okay, when we have our own little personal objects that no one else sees and no one else really knows about except us, they're the things that tend to go missing. And I'd say if there's one thing that it's like a cartoon, and you can scrub a slide out of a cartoon and something goes missing, and then it reappears again when you put another frame in. It's that style of way of looking at this phenomenon, and I think it's probably the best way to look at it. But by all means, I mean it's up in the air. But I think I'm happiest with that. So again, I think we're talking about strong nose and weak nose, and it's about how we interpret reality. So that's the end. I had to rush it a little bit there because I know we're coming short of time.